What's up, everybody? Welcome back to part 3 of my 4-part mini-series on my trip to Yellowstone and things that I wanted to share that for you to know or how things went with that trip. So this is part 3, and part 3 is simply 5 things that I wish I knew before I went to Yellowstone Park the first time. And I'm sharing these in an effort to maybe hopefully make, if you're planning a trip to Yellowstone, it a little bit easier or better for you. So I want to just before I get into this video proper, I want to just make a quick note on 2022. So 2022 has been a really weird year for Yellowstone. There was the unprecedented flooding event in June that caused the destruction of the northeast and north entrance roads, and as a result has altered the ability for you to access stuff in the park, including being able to get to the Lamar Valley. Now, it's probably going to take years for those roads to be repaired. And on top of that, they've had a workforce shortage at the hotels and for the concessionaires in Yellowstone in 2022, which may or may not be a problem going forward. The short of it is if you are going to the park probably next year in 2023, some of these problems may be resolved, some of them may not be. So check with the hotel and the park service before you go to see what's going on. However, what this means for this video is that some of the things that I'm covering may not actually apply or may be available again in a certain, in the near future. However, I'm going to talk about things because I want to kind of try to keep this as general as I can. So, the first thing that I wish I really understood when I went to Yellowstone the first time was travel times. This is by far the biggest factor in pretty much anything you do in the park. And the truth is, I find that the travel times are very deceptive. So the Grand Loop Road in Yellowstone National Park, I like to describe it as a 7-segment display. The kind of things you see on cheap LED clocks or watches. A lot of people like to describe it as a figure 8. The reason I like a 7-segment display is that the roads don't exactly cross in the middle. There's actually a segment there that's fairly reasonable in terms of length for you to drive. So the general gist of it is from major village or point of interest in the park to major village in the park. So from like Old Faithful to Grant, or Old Faithful to Norris, or Norris to Canyon, or whatever. Expect to take driving 25 to 45 minutes at minimum. So that's just based on speed limits and roads. Based on that, if you have to drive from one corner of the park to the other corner of the park, expect that to be a 2.5-hour drive. And entrance roads to the park, they are also quite long. The shortest was the Gardner to Mammoth North entrance, which was only about a 10-minute drive. But most of the other entrance roads are somewhere in the 25 to 45 minutes range as well. On top of just the time it takes, you need to be prepared for basically expected and unexpected delays. So road construction, road work in Yellowstone, the work season in Montana and Yellowstone specifically is only in the summer. It's very short, and generally speaking, when they go to do something like rebuild a road, they either close the road completely, which means you may have to completely reroute your plans, or they will tear the whole road out and you'll have pilot cars and basically one-way traffic at reduced speed through the construction site. So you will end up sitting and waiting. On top of that, there's plenty of wildlife, and the wildlife will block the roads. Buffalo, they don't care. They will stand in the middle of the road. The herd will cross the road. It'll take 5 or 10 minutes, etc. That's just the reality of driving around in Yellowstone. On top of that, of course, you have things like bear jams. So people see a bear and everybody pulls over and stops in the road, or stops on the side of the road, or in the road in a lot of cases, to see the bear. Expect just running into the traffic for a bear jam, expect that to be a good 10 or 15 minutes just to get by, assuming you're not stopping to see the bears. Finally, there are a lot of places in the park where rock or mud can slide into the road. The Yellowstone National Park has heavy equipment to clear this. but that means closing the road until that stuff is cleared. So the first time that I went out there, when we were driving through the Gibbon Canyon by Gibbon Falls, there had been a rock slide. Park Service had to clear that before they could reopen the road. That was a 20-ish minute delay of sitting there waiting for that to happen. So expect that kind of thing. Now, I wish I had done this the first time that I went to Yellowstone, or before I went to Yellowstone, but I've done it now, and I'll make it available. I will put a link to download this in the description. But this is the road system in Yellowstone National Park, with the major communities outside the park drawn essentially as a time/transit map. So everything, the times or the minimum times that it would take to get between places, I have outlined on this map, so you can get a good idea of, use for planning purposes at least, of how long it takes to get somewhere. As I said, I put a link to this in the description. So, number 2, where to stay. I'm going to start this with a generic comment of inside or outside the park. Obviously, there are choices. So my personal preference with all of the national parks is to stay inside the park. The general reasoning that I have for this is it puts me closer to things. And time is a major factor when you're only going to be somewhere for a few days or whatnot, and having to drive, potentially 2 hours to get to somewhere for sunrise, or not getting there for sunrise, getting there much later in the day, is going to affect what you can do for your photography if you're doing photography. So in the hotels inside the park, obviously there's campgrounds as well, RV grounds too. The hotels inside the park put you closer to things. Now, the cons to doing that is obviously the hotels in the park are probably going to be more expensive than the hotels outside of the park. Most of the hotels in most of the national parks, but this is especially true in Yellowstone, are historic buildings. They have limited amount of space. They book very quickly. So on top of cost, you also need to be looking at way in advanced reservations. Generally speaking, with Yellowstone, you need to be looking to make reservations when they start booking a year in advance for your trip, or you're probably not going to find a room. Now, staying outside the park, obviously there's going to be more options because there's more places to stay, is potentially going to be cheaper because there's a wider variety of costs that you can have, but you're going to pay for that in drive times. And as I said in the first part, and if you look at the chart or the map that I made, some of the entrance roads have some pretty significant drive times. And as things currently stand, the entrance roads with the shortest drive times are closed because they're the ones that washed out. So if you're staying inside the park, where do I recommend staying? So my number one choice, now I haven't personally stayed here, but my number one choice is to stay in Canyon Village. There's a lodge there. There's some new construction there. Looks pretty nice from the pictures. All of the hotels in the park, in my experience, are pretty nice, or very nice. But why I pick Canyon as the sort of best in-park place is that it's centrally located on the eastern side of the Grand Loop Road. So you have reasonable driving distance to pretty much anything in the park. And as I said, if you're only going to stay in one hotel in the park, having reasonable driving distances is certainly a good thing. So on top of that, it's also walking distance to the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. So from the hotel in Canyon, it's a half-mile walk, so about 10-minute walk to the north rim of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. And then on top of that, it's a 1.5-mile walk if you want to walk all the way to the north side of the Upper Yellowstone Falls. Lower Yellowstone Falls are in the middle of that. So it's a pretty reasonable walk if you don't even, you can go do Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone Falls. You don't even have to worry about driving. You can just walk it. South side of the Yellowstone Falls, so if you want to get to the observation deck points there, it is a drive, but it's really only about a 5-minute drive to get there, so it's pretty damn quick. Gas and service is also available, which is useful because there's a lot of driving in the park, and, having the ability to put air in your tires or get gas, that's not necessarily a bad thing to have. And as I said, there's camping and RV sites. Now from Canyon, Mammoth and Old Faithful are about an hour drive, which is long, but fairly reasonable. The Lamar Valley, when it's open, is about an hour drive over Dunraven Pass. Turn left or turn right at Tower and follow the northeast entrance road towards the Lamar Valley. The Hayden Valley is only about a 15-minute drive. It's turn left at Canyon Junction and head south on the Grand Loop Road, and you get to the Hayden Valley. So there's not a whole lot of, or there's a lot of stuff that's very reasonably located in terms of time from the Canyon Hotel or Canyon Village. Now, my second choice, if you can't get into Canyon for whatever reason, is Lake Yellowstone. Lake Yellowstone Fishing Bridge, Bridge Bay. There's campsites, there's RV parks, there's the lake hotel, there's the lake cabins. It's not quite as centrally located as the Canyon Hotel is, but you have facilities at both lake and fishing bridge, so general stores, you have gas stations, there's gas and service at fishing bridge, not lake. There's a clinic at lake in case you're worried about like where if you get injured or minor injuries or something like that. And as I said, there's camping and RV sites all over the place. Now it's not quite as centrally located, so it's about an hour and a half drive from Lake to Mammoth or the Lamar Valley. It's about an hour drive to Old Faithful. It's about a 15-minute drive, again, going back towards Canyon to the Hayden Valley, and it's about a 30-minute drive to the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. Now, plus side, you're right on Lake Yellowstone, so... Now, ideally, what I would recommend doing is not staying in any one hotel, if you have the time to do this, but to move around the park and stay at a number of places. You may not stay everywhere, but if you move, you can shorten drive times and you can make it much easier to get to and see things. So, for example, if you really want to spend time in the Lamar Valley, you might want to consider staying at the Roosevelt Cabins because they are the closest in-park hotel to the Lamar Valley. Now, again, this is pending all the roads being reopened. Additionally, for example, staying outside of the park in Cook City is a good place to stay if you want to get, access to the Lamar Valley. Likewise, if you want to do Mammoth Hot Springs, stay in Mammoth. It's walking distance. You don't have to drive to do anything. You can just walk. If you want to look at, if you're interested in Yellowstone or Old Faithful and the geyser basin there, stay at Old Faithful. Make your life easy with respect to driving. Also, keep in mind, parking in a lot of places in the various villages is limited, and when the park gets busy, parking becomes something that's incredibly challenging to find. Now, obviously, staying outside the park is the other option. There's 5 nearby cities or communities that you would normally consider if you're staying in Yellowstone. 3 of them I would recommend considering if you decide you want to stay outside the park. Normally, the 2 of those would be Gardner and Cook City, so those are would be normally good options, but right now with the park, with the road situation, there's no access to them, so they're not really available. Currently, the best option for staying outside the park, I believe, is West Yellowstone, Montana. It's centrally located on the west side of the park, and the west entrance road feeds right into approximately the middle of the Grand Loop Road on that side, though it is a fairly long drive in that entrance road. Places I wouldn't stay outside of the park are Cody, Wyoming and Jackson, Wyoming. Not that there's anything wrong with Cody or Jackson, they're lovely places, but it's an almost 2-hour drive to get to the Grand Loop Road from either of those places, so you're talking really long drives. Now, there are hotels, lodges, etc. along the entrance road, like the east entrance road on the way to Cody. That might be possible or options you might want to consider. Additionally, there's hotels along outside of Yellowstone along the south entrance road or the road down to Jackson. However, those are mostly, or all of them actually, are inside Grand Teton National Park. So you're just trading staying in one national park for staying in another national park. Number 3, dining and food. I like to eat when I travel. I don't eat out a lot when I'm at home, so it's a nice luxury when I'm traveling, and I like good food and being able to eat there. There are restaurants inside Yellowstone National Park at all of the major villages in the park. You basically have 2 options. You have eateries, fast food, lunch counters, whatever you want to call them, within the general stores that are available in each of the villages, so, or most of the villages, I should say, that are catering around like hot dogs, hamburgers, that kind of thing. Those all have the same menus. On the other hand, you have the hotels. And the hotel restaurants, there's basically 3 levels of service, of food service in the hotels. So you have main dining rooms, which each have different menus depending on the hotel. There are fast food restaurants within the hotel realm that have basically the same menu across all of the hotels where they are. And then there are like snack shops, like delis and type things where you can grab a sandwich and that kind of thing. Now, the major point on the whole dining situation comes down to when the restaurants close and travel time. So the major hotel restaurants typically close at 10 p.m. And for dinner, most of them require reservations. Currently in 2022, they're only taking reservations for hotel guests, but memory serves, when we were there, or when I was there in 2018, the reservations you could get just about, anybody could get, there wasn't that limitation. Now, the grab-and-go type places, the hotel fast food joints, they are typically closed around 7 p.m., and the general stores with the deli or with the lunch counters type things in them, those close at around 6 p.m. Now, I say typically for all of these, the hours you want to check, they vary somewhat from time of year to time of year, season to season, etc. But the point here is that if you were driving all the way across the park, like I was on my first trip, because of bad planning on where to stay, and you wanted to be in the Lamar Valley until sunset, and sunset's at 8 o'clock or 8:30, and it's a 2.5-hour drive to get back to the Old Faithful Hotel, you're not gonna. I wasn't getting there by closing time at the restaurant. So I either would have to, if you're doing something like that, you either have to know where you're going and pack lunch or pack dinner or whatever, or it's going to impact where you are going to shoot. Okay, so let's get to the photography already. Number 4, where and when to shoot and what to shoot there. So what to shoot may seem stupid, and I went into Yellowstone the first time I went there expecting Yellowstone is all about wildlife. That's the only thing I'm going to shoot in wildlife. And that was pretty much my big takeaway from Yellowstone. The first time I went there was, there's really good landscapes, but I didn't know where they were. Most of what I shot was wildlife. Now, my experience has been very early in the season, so late May, early June, and my experience has been most of the activity is in the northern 2/3 of the park, especially if you're looking for bears. Now, that's not to say that there aren't bears in the southern part of the park. There's plenty of areas around Old Faithful that are closed, but in the time that I've been there, I've never seen a bear south of lake. Again, I'm not saying that they aren't, it's just my experience has been that way. Of course, the thing with wildlife is there's nobody to tell you, or there's no way to tell you this is where the bears are going to be at this such time, because the bears don't listen to me. Bison were pretty much all over the place. So if you're interested in photographing bison, there were tons of bison around Old Faithful. The first time I was there weren't so many this time. This again too depends on the weather. It depends on the winter, the snows, etc., where the wildlife is going to go. What threw me is landscapes. So I was not expecting to find much in the way of landscapes that I would really like in Yellowstone. Some waterfalls, maybe, thermal features, maybe, I don't know, but I'm not a huge, the first time I went, I was really just not expecting landscapes. I pretty much, on the first trip, because I went to Yellowstone and Grand Teton, I was expecting to shoot wildlife in Yellowstone and landscapes at Grand Teton, and that was it. Thermal features are obviously something you can shoot. Mammoth, Old Faithful, West Thumb, Geyser Basin, there's geysers, hot springs, etc. The Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone is a big, impressive landscape, but what I wasn't expecting the first time, and I wish I'd had a better appreciation for, was that there are some really epic landscapes in Yellowstone if you know where to look. So a lot of the caldera, that is the main part of the southern half of the park, roughly, is pretty smooth, hilly. Like, it's not mountainous, and it doesn't make for super epic landscapes. However, if you get up into the northeast corner of the park in the Lamar Valley, you get into some really epic looking landscapes. Dunraven Pass has got some interesting sort of perspective landscapes on mountains and whatnot. Along with Dunraven Pass, you have Tower Falls in the Tower Falls area, which has some very interesting rock features and whatnot for, again, along the Gibbon River. The Gibbon River on the west side of the park has cut a pretty steep canyon. There's a really nice waterfall there that Gibbon Falls that is really kind of interesting. And then Gibbon Meadows at the start of the headwaters of the river basically it's a picturesque meadow, for lack of a better word, with mountains in the background. Along the north section of the Grand Loop Road is also something that I found very nice to shoot. There's a lot of mountain. It's a fairly steep valley. There's mountains, grass, etc. It makes kind of a nice landscape. Now, as for when to shoot, well, the standard rules apply. For landscapes and wildlife, you want to shoot 3 to 4 hours either after sunrise or before sunset. That's when you're going to see the most activity. That's when you're going to have the best light. Now, that said, always have a camera ready, because the bears don't care. The wolves don't care. There's going to be photo opportunities at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. The light's not going to be great, but it's going to be an opportunity that you probably don't want to pass up. Okay, so the next question, photography related, is what gear really is and isn't important? What do you really need to have? So I'm going to just say straight up from experience that you absolutely don't need to go full pro. And the reality is that if you're doing it because you think that that's what you need, or you're like, me, feeling inadequate at times with your puny little 100 to 500, the guy next to you is probably going to outgear you anyway. I can't tell you how many times, even shooting with a 600 f4, I rented one for the first trip that I went out there, somebody would pull up, jump out of their car, and have an 800 or something ridiculous, or a 600 and a 400 and an 800. And it was like, it's a photography sort of hot spot in the United States. Expect people with huge equipment to be there. Now, the reality too of this is that in many of the places where I was shooting and I was getting a picture that I thought was mediocre, so was the guy next to me with the big gear. So not having huge amounts of equipment doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have huge amounts of you're going to have better pictures. So what you absolutely need is a camera, obviously. A telephoto lens. An iPhone is the wrong tool. I know a lot of people will tell you that you can do everything with an iPhone, but it is the wrong tool for wildlife photography in Yellowstone, where everything is essentially bigger than you are and more dangerous than you are, at least assuming you're not a hunter. And I would also recommend a standard or wide angle lens. So I like a 24 to 70 zoom, a standard size zoom. If you're shooting crop, an 18 to 55 covers the same basis. Now, a useful to have piece of kit is a teleconverter. There are times where you just need a little bit more reach because the bear is a little bit further away than you can reasonably get to. That's where the teleconverter comes in. So if your telephoto lens supports one, a teleconverter is good to have. What I don't find necessarily all that useful is an ultra wide. Now, this depends on how you shoot landscapes, how you shoot wide angle stuff. I tend to stitch panos together for landscapes because that's just the way I think about working for things. There are certainly times where an ultra wide is going to be the right tool for a certain kind of image. If that kind of image rocks your boat, then obviously take an ultra wide, but I have never found it to be that useful. Broadly speaking, I could shoot at 24 millimeters on a full frame camera, so 16 to 18 millimeters on a crop camera, and I have the compositions that I want even for landscapes. So the question with respect to the big gear, do you need a 600 f4? And the short answer to this is no, you don't. A 600 can be useful. It doesn't need to be a 600 f4. Something like a 150 to 600 or a 200 to 600 is certainly entirely within the realm of being useful and practical. And in some ways, I would argue even better than a 600 f4 because it's smaller and lighter and handier and easier to use, and having the zoom capabilities means that you don't have to grab a second camera or change lenses when stuff gets closer. That said, a 500 is just as good. So this last trip I took a 100 to 500 and I never felt that I was pressured into a situation, or I never felt in a situation that I needed a 600 to be what, in the right realm. And generally speaking, and maybe this is just the time of year or whatnot, that my experience in Yellowstone has been that there's a big telephoto lens problem. And it really comes down to, the biggest part of it is, for me at least, is heat shimmer. Regardless of what I'm shooting over, grassy meadows, snow, snow's especially bad, lakes or ponds, etc., I almost always end up with heat shimmer if I'm shooting at really long distances. If I'm shooting under tree cover, then obviously that's not so much of a problem, but the longer the lens, the bigger that problem ends up being. On top of that, in most cases, you're not shooting from way above whatever it is that you're photographing. So you're not 40 feet above the bear that's 300 yards away or whatever, or 100 yards away. You're at the same level or below the level of the bear because it's up the side of a hill. In which case, if you're shooting with a really long lens, you tend to end up shooting through a lot of grass and brush that's out of focus to the point that you can't really see it in the image when you're shooting, but it is there and it is impacting the contrast, the color, and the quality of the image that you're getting. Not necessarily ideal. Not always the case, but it's something to be aware of, and the longer the lens, the more that tends to be a potential problem. And then, of course, there's the whole thing with weight and stability and motion blur. So the bigger the lens, the heavier it is. That means tripods or monopods and keeping it stable. There really is a technique to shooting effectively with a 600 f4 due to the size and weight of the lens. And then, of course, the bigger, the more magnification you have, and the higher the resolution your camera sensor is, the more motion blur you get from the subject moving. It covers more pixels. The faster your shutter speed you need to stop motion, and that becomes its own spiraling factor consideration. But in general, the thing to remember is that getting closer gets you better images than getting a bigger lens does. Of course, you can't always get closer, but that's sort of the rule. So my experience with all of this is I rented a 600 f4 on my first trip. In fact, I also rented a 2x teleconverter. So I was shooting at times at up to 1200 millimeters. And pretty much anything that I shot beyond 600, I considered to be pretty meh. They weren't fantastic images. They had problems. Now, as I said, on this last trip, I only took my RF 100 to 500, and I had a 1.4 teleconverter for it. 500 never really felt like a limitation for me compared to what I was doing with the 600. On top of that, the lens was so light that compared to the 600 that I could actually handhold it for an extended period of time, which meant I was on the subject longer, which meant I had a much better chance of capturing something interesting as opposed to having to keep putting the lens down because it's 8 pounds and heavy. Now, all of that said, if you do have a 600, obviously take your 600, 600 f4, whatever, take it. Of course, if you have one, I don't know why you're listening to me about camera gear for this kind of trip. But anyway, if you don't, my recommendation is not to jump at renting one. If you have something that's in the 400 to 500 range, a 100 to 400, a 100 to 500, a 150 to 600, a 200 to 500, a 200 to 600, something like that. If you already have that, take that, use that. Don't worry about getting a 600 f4. So let's talk briefly about camera specs, because this is the other thing. The dude that rocks up with the 4 Super Telephoto Primes probably has Z9s or 1DXs or something crazy professional level camera on the back of them. First of all, sensor format. I know everybody in the world of photography is all enamored with full frame at this point, but crop is still entirely useful and valid. And in reality, crop sensors in somewhere like Yellowstone aren't really the enemy. In fact, I wouldn't say they're not the enemy for even a lot of travel photography. The short of it is that the smaller sensor lets you use a shorter focal length to get the same composition, and that means you tend to be able to carry a smaller and lighter lens. You don't need a 600 f4. You can do it with a 400 f4 or a 300 2.8 on 4/3 or something to that effect. It's not as big of a factor. Also, if you have a full frame camera, pretty much all of the mirrorlesses will do this. Don't be afraid to use crop mode if it makes sense. So I know a lot of people will also tell you never crop in camera, never use crop mode on your camera because, if you do that, then, you're just throwing away options. Why would you do that? Well, I used crop mode on my R5 a lot on this trip. And basically my consideration for when I would flip the camera into crop mode was this. Am I going to have to crop the picture in post anyway? Like if the bear is far enough away that I know I'm going to have to crop down to crop, a 1.6 crop or whatever anyway, I might as well just do it in the camera. It saves space, gives me more buffer for shooting in bursts. Big one for mirrorless cameras, it increases the viewfinder magnification. So it's not like a DSLR where it just could draw a box in the viewfinder and that was like, this is where it's actually taking the picture. With mirrorless, you actually get a more magnified viewfinder image. Well, that more magnified viewfinder image meant that I could see what the bear was doing. And that meant that I could make better images because I'm not just hoping and guessing. I can actually see, is it looking up? Is it looking down? Is it looking away from me? Whatever. So if you do have especially a high resolution full frame camera, an R5, an A7R, an A1, a Z9, a Z7 Mark II, whatever, anything like that, consider using crop mode when it makes sense. And it makes sense when you'd have to do the cropping anyway. Now, frame rate. Again, most of the people that will pull up next to you in Yellowstone, they're going to be carrying full frame professional cameras. Well, I won't say most of them, a lot of them that are shooting 20 or 30 frames a second at this point. So the Z9, the R3, the A1, whatever, they can shoot these ridiculously high frame rates. Now, it's true, wildlife can be fast paced. If you're there in the middle of the bison rut, or you happen to get two bears fighting, having a decent frame rate is a useful thing to have. That said, you don't need 20 or 30 frames per second to be successful. The first trip that I went, I carried 5D Mark IVs. They have 6.5 frame per second continuous shooting. That was more than adequate. Now, I would say you do want 5 frames a second or more, but something in the 5 to 10 frames per second or 10 frame per second range, which is starting to be very standard for a lot of cameras now, is, perfectly reasonable. But 5 to 10 frames per second will do the job. The final thought on the cameras, and this is the real big differentiator in a lot of cases now, is the autofocus system. So subject detection is obviously nice to have. That said, no current camera system, mirrorless or whatever, is designed with subject detection for bison or bears or pronghorn or moose or elk. Now, my experience with the R5 was that subject detection did extremely well with these things, even though it's not designed to focus on them, at least for the whole subject. Eye detection or eye focusing or tracking didn't work at all for any of them. I had no instance where the eye tracking actually tracked the eye properly. That said, don't count on subject detection to work for the wildlife, at least until some camera maker actually starts targeting these kinds of species as something that they're doing. It'll probably work, but don't count your chickens there before they hatch. So as a result, good single point autofocus or expanded autofocus is important to have, and it's important to be proficient with it. Probably more than anything, in my experience with the camera, is proficiency. Being comfortable working the camera that you're using and being comfortable moving things around like autofocus points is far more useful than having the most modern whiz-bang features. And as for tracking speed, well, generally speaking, super fast tracking isn't that necessary. At the distances that you're going to be shooting at, almost every mirrorless or DSLR can track the subject matter at the speeds they're moving. They're nothing. You don't want a bear close enough that it has a hard time. The camera can't keep up with it in terms of tracking speed. So those are the 5 things that I wish I knew before I went the first time. The camera stuff would have certainly saved me a little money, at least with the long thing. And that said, I want to wrap this up with a little bonus tip, and these are some favorite and least favorite spots that I found in Yellowstone while I was there. So my favorites, one that actually blew my mind is the Lamar Valley proper. Now, I didn't actually get to the Lamar Valley the first time I was there. I ended up turning around just before I got to the Lamar Valley, so like just at the Lamar Canyon. I got confused on where I was. I thought I was further than I actually was, but that was a mistake. The Lamar Valley proper, if you can get there, because, you know, again, the road situation is problematic, you know, right now and for the foreseeable future, it is pretty impressive. So you have a broad green valley, at least it was green when I was there, that's wide. It's a really nice valley, full of bison and wildlife. But the thing that really blew my mind was when you get to the northeast end of the Lamar Valley, it is punctuated by the epic Canadian Rocky-like landscapes. So the mountains that have sheer drops at the very tops and then smooth out or taper out towards the bottom. Really impressive area photography-wise, for me at least. The Tower Falls area. I drove by there the first time I was there, but I didn't actually stop at Tower Falls and walk out. Tower Falls was pretty impressive for a waterfall. It's not the biggest waterfall in Yellowstone, but it was a pretty nice photographically waterfall. But there is a lot of interesting rock and geology in the area around Tower Falls. The other side of the canyon has some very interesting geology at the top that makes for some interesting pictures, and I thought that was, of course, very interesting. The Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone is also a big favorite of mine. I would say it's a do not miss. It's the Yellowstone Falls, upper and lower, are pretty epic, and you can get some pretty epic shots there, especially if you get the light right and you get the skies, a good day for skies. Now, my least favorite spots in the whole park basically were anywhere that there was thermal features. It's not that I don't like thermal features, but you run into a lot of problems that make them very kind of hard to do well. So unless you're there in the hottest days of the year and the humidity is already pretty high, steam is an issue. There will be steam everywhere. So when I was there in early May and it was still cool, you couldn't see much of anything on account of the steam. On top of that, don't forget your polarizer because you're going to need it. The reflections will kill all of the interesting color that is in these thermal features, so you're going to want to have a polarizer to deal with that. And then the reality is that by and large, with the exception of catching a good geyser erupting, things like Grand Prismatic Springs or many of the pools, which you see pictures of all the time, they look really impressive, but the reality is those pictures were shot from an airplane with long lens and ideal conditions, and it took weeks and weeks for the everything to be perfect for those photographs. From the ground, especially like Grand Prismatic Springs, it really lacks the oomph that those pictures have. It just is not that impressive when you're 6 feet above it instead of 600 feet above it. But in general, like I said, all of the thermal features, I find them very difficult to find really interesting or impressive photos. That said, there is definitely interesting and impressive sort of macro scale stuff to be found in them. So if you are doing that, do keep an eye out for that. So I'm going to wrap this up here. I hope it was helpful if you are looking to plan a trip to Yellowstone to understand some of these things that I wish I understood better when I went. If this was helpful or useful or at least interesting or informative to you, please let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. And share if you know somebody who's planning a trip to Yellowstone. Maybe kick them a link to this so that they can get some advantage of this. Not all of this stuff was photography related, but it is kind of general use anyway. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.